You ever wonder how we got here? Recently I was talking with Brian Villalobos, the voice actor for Lodi and a new player within the ecosystem of Destiny. He's seeing the whole game for the first time, and it's been really refreshing to hear his perspective. He's getting to see all of the new parts of the game that we may have played years ago, but for him it's all fresh. He is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about all of it. And whilst he, by his own admission, doesn't know exactly what's going on all the time, it's definitely been so exciting to see his take on things because he doesn't have any of the baggage. He is seeing the good and the bad at the same time, and he gets to talk about what he really enjoys with Destiny. But the other day, when we were sitting down to make content in some regard, he actually sat there and asked a question of me, which is just, how are things? How have things been doing? The honest answer left me kind of conflicted because, well, things have been kind of awful. To speak very briefly from my own perspective as someone who creates content on this game, my fate is tied to Destiny in a pretty substantial way. Much as I've tried to diversify out and will continue to do so, I am still unquestionably Destiny's quote-unquote lore daddy, and as you all love to remind me so fondly, I'm the reason why some of you are able to even keep up with the story of this game. It's what pays my bills. Making videos on Destiny, doing streams now. It's required that this goes well if I'm going to keep my economic prospects in the exact same place. Unfortunately, Destiny is not doing so well right now, and that means that I, like many other Destiny creators, am starting to feel the strain. But you don't need to hear that from a content creator who happens to make their living off of the game in order to know that that's the case. In fact, I imagine that there's a bunch of you who don't want to hear anything about that because, well, I get a very cushy job out of this, and I'm very lucky to be in this position, regardless of whether it's leading to a negative downturn right now or not. So, ultimately, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about today. I'll be fine. What I want to talk about today is how the Destiny community at large is doing, and to ask that question of how we got here. The recent launch of the Epic Raid might have gone down relatively well, but there has been such a hiving negativity to the community recently that lots of players have started to consider whether or not they should even be here. This of course is not helped by the fact that Bungie as a studio has made a series of ham-fisted decisions lately, ones that seem to be tone-deaf, out of touch, and contradictory to some of their earlier statements about where they were trying to take the game. All of this is to sit there and say that when Brian asked me the other day about how things were, I really did not know initially how to respond. And I think you can actually hear it in that moment in the stream that I did with Fallout, where we played through the Witch Queen campaign with Brian. Him and I sat there and didn't know exactly how to respond at first. And honestly, I did have that question running through my head, with seemingly no easy answer. How did we get here? Today, I want to try and answer that question, and I wanted to do so with the kind of retrospective look at what Destiny was, both as a product, and from the perspective of someone who has been a player of Destiny for the last decade. Because the reality is, I remember so many times from before now where Destiny was not what it is now. And I don't mean that in terms of the game having changed. I mean that in terms of the community having changed. You see, going back in the day, it was different. We've lost something along the way. And I think that's what I really want to get back to and to try and revive today. I know that that's not going to happen because, well, you can't go back in time. But ultimately, I still think that there is something that's been lost along the way that's really important. And I'm not here to necessarily assign blame all the time, but I feel as though this is something that is also something we could have potentially done something to prevent. Not just from the perspective of Bungie as a studio, but also from the perspective of ourselves as players. I don't know. It's hard to sit there and say what is or isn't the right move anymore. And frankly, interacting with the community sometimes now is a dangerous prospect. I mean that, by the way. I've had death threats. Not recently, but over the entire history of my time in this game. That maybe shouldn't be surprising. It's 12 years. Everyone has probably gotten at least one or two of them, and I've been lucky enough that they've not seriously panned out. That being said, I can't help but think back to the first time when I ever saw anything to do with Destiny. 12 years ago. That was when I saw my first Destiny trailer, and it evoked in me something really powerful at the time. I'd just finished my drive towards getting accepted into uni, and at that point in time I felt like I was finally free to follow any new passion that I wanted to. I decided to become a fan of a game from a studio that made another thing I loved. Halo. Whilst I had played Halo 2 and Halo 3, it was Halo Reach where I got my first real taste of content creation, and where I really considered my fandom to explode and evolve. Bungie's final outing into the series is a divisive one compared to their other entries, but I'll never forget those nights spent laughing till my face was red as me and my friends played the latest map that someone had made on Forge World, or running Firefight for the 2000th time. This was one of the first experiences I think I've ever had with being a member of a community where it felt like it mattered. And the strange thing is that it wasn't actually about any of that at the time. I didn't consider myself to be a part of the community. I just thought of this as friendship and fun. That feeling persisted through to my first days as an early fan of Destiny. Back in the days before it initially released, there was this sort of indescribable magic to the game's fan base. It felt as though there was truly limitless potential, and we were all happy to be there. It seems wild now, but I remember back in the day, I was posting merrily on Bungie.net forum groups, talking about the game, and honestly, there was no salt, no anger, only marveling at the possibilities and the enthusiasm that what we had in front of us was being made by the people who made Halo. I met some of the community members that would go on to work at Bungie years later. I met some of the people that I consider close friends to this day. Fast forward to 2014, the release of Destiny Vanilla, and yeah.
Its lack of competent storytelling, its repetitive, downright amateurish mission designs, and its extremely frustrating RNG loot.
Destiny is straddling a border between too many kinds of experiences, and in its attempt to have something for everyone, it never fully satisfies on any one front.
The entire game is a repetitive grind. Every single mission is exactly the same thing.
Alas, Destiny wastes the opportunity to develop a mystery worth caring about, and reverts to more fetch quests followed by a manipulative ending that reminds you that the game's soundtrack does far more work in establishing this world's tone than the mediocre writing ever does.
You done fucked it up!
It's so strange to see how things can turn within a community inside of a 24-hour window. The community I had known to be a place of joy quickly soured and turned into a place of frustration and anger. For my part, I had become a content creator properly now, and I was pushing to ensure that I could get as much done within the game as possible to make video content, and to be honest, I understood all the vitriol, I understood the frustration. Even though there were parts of Destiny that I loved, it had not lived up to the expectation of what I thought it could be. Back in the day, I was on the first Destiny podcast ever made, Guardian Radio, and I remember that in that week after the game released, we'd actually had Deej, the community manager at the time, on the show, and our host, Mark Ducott, primed him at the time, saying that they would open the show with a joke about him being here for us to burn him at the stake, which we then proceeded to do, because ultimately, he knew that he was there not to talk about how things were hunky-dory, but instead to try and belay the community's concerns, and to ensure that everyone was going to be on the same page and understood what Bungie wanted us to understand, that they knew the game needed work, and that they were going to take our concerns seriously. The idea of burning Deej at the stake as a joke was a joke, but it's not hard to understand the context of it. People were mad at Bungie. And it wasn't very long until I started seeing the phrase that would haunt Destiny creators for the next decade. Dead game. But we all continued to cover a supposedly dead game for a long time, with some people leaving, some people returning, and some people arriving fresh for the first time. I think there's only a few of us OG Destiny creators left that I remember from back in the day. Myself, Leopard, Datto, a few others for certain. We've always had ups and downs, but nothing has ever been quite so severe as it is now. Destiny's first saga has ended, and it seems like the second one has not started with the same kind of momentum that Bungie needed. And it also seems like there's almost nothing that Bungie can get completely right. And so, in this place, where it's been 12 years since seeing my first Destiny trailer and feeling that excitement, I'm now wondering how we got here, where things are so very, very miserable. But let me clarify, because I'm not wondering how Bungie got to the place it did necessarily. It was, in my opinion, excessive executive greed and mismanagement. We all know what to do at this point in time: follow the trail of cars, layoffs, and expensive incubation projects that ultimately went nowhere. Again, not to beat a dead Mustang on that one, but I think we all know who to blame. No, today I'm thinking about what it's like to be a Destiny fan, both now and in the past. I want to talk about what happened to the community and how the studio both stopped that at certain points and exacerbated it in others. I want to talk about how we went from a community where it felt like we were part of a greater whole to a place where now it feels as though we're all just separate cogs, parts in a machine that doesn't work when you put it together, that is broken and segmented and disjointed, and which doesn't necessarily fit anymore. I want to talk about how all of this feels as well, because I feel like some of us fundamentally need to change the relationship we have with the game, because I think it has become an unhealthy thing. I also am well aware that I say this as a content creator who inevitably has all of the associated baggage. There are going to be people who watch this and ask if I was paid by Bungie, with some ignoring common sense and going as far as to say that they have a gun to my head. There are going to be some who will say the exact opposite and will state that this video was designed to take aim at a studio in crisis, with people that are working hard there, that are not responsible for the things that ail the game and who I'm helping to bring hatred to. To both these groups of people, I know there's not much that can be done to stop you from having those opinions. Have at it. It's been 10 years. I've lived alongside you long enough. You've lived alongside me long enough. I'm sure everyone's got their opinions of any content creator at this point. And, well, if that's the case, I'm pretty sure anything I have to say at this point is not going to be enough to dissuade you from that opinion. Today, I wanted to, however, couch my position as a creator somewhat, unless it's really relevant. I wanted to talk about how I feel as a fan of Destiny, because I've always been a fan of Destiny, and I feel like that's the perspective I hold that is more relevant to this, because, well, at a certain point in time, if you've played this game, I'm sure you also considered yourself a fan, even if that status that you had as a fan has definitely waxed and waned. And whilst I can't think of a single Destiny creator that hasn't had to make tough choices lately regarding their financial situation, I'm sure you also know that being a content creator for anything puts you in a position of immense privilege, especially on my end because it's the only real job I've ever known. And yes, I count it as real, damn it, I'm paying very real taxes. But the point is, I've never been a service worker. I've never had a 9-to-5 office job. I've never done manual labor. And for all the mental anguish that a parasocial hellscape like YouTube or Twitter can put someone through, I've never dealt with the anguish of a shitty boss, or being laid off, or having to get yet another closing and opening night shift done. So yeah, substantially less talk about my perspective as a creator for the moment. I want to talk about this topic as someone who has, for the longest time, considered himself a fan of Destiny, for as much turmoil and as much joy as that has brought me at different times. It'll be hard to divorce my opinion completely from that creator position, but I will try my best to make sure that I'm only referencing it when absolutely relevant or necessary. I have some data that's unique to me, so, you know what? I might as well talk about it in general terms when it makes sense. It helps to inform my opinion, but I think it also helps to give a bigger picture. It's not the whole picture itself, though. I might as well use it where I have it, and where it matters. But for the most part, it doesn't change the fact that I've been a fan. On top of that, though, it seems like a really terrible time to make this kind of segue, but I still need to pay my bills in times like these. So yeah, I have a sponsor for this video. I apologize because the tone is going to rapidly shift here. I was going to put this on a different video, but the crunch of everything that was happening and recent events, well, they put me in a very different position. So, you have it on this video now. Over to a somewhat happier version of me from a few weeks ago, I guess. Enjoy. We partnered with Geology to bring you this lore video. You probably know Geology by this point. They're a long-running sponsor on the channel and I've used them for years. They're an award-winning skincare brand who have helped thousands of people on the path to better skincare. Specifically, if you're watching my videos, it's more than statistically likely that their products are useful to you because you're a dude in your 20s or 30s most likely. And if that is you, hey! How does it feel knowing that Halo 2 is almost legally old enough to drink? If that sentence gives you a degree of existential dread, hi, welcome. Also, you're probably at the age where you're starting to take care of yourself a lot more. Skincare is an important part of that, and for us dudes, it's also important for finding your partner. Or AI girlfriend, I suppose. Wait, hold up. Wait, that's her story in Halo 5? Luckily, it won't take you an entire game and 2.5 levels full of flood in order for you to find your ideal skincare routine. That can be done in about 2 minutes with Geology's personalized quiz. You can also look for options in a wide range of prices for moments where you're on a budget or moments when you're balling out. Geology also comes with only dermatologist approved and tested ingredients so you can trust their products. Best of all though, it's just easy to use. It's got a really simple step-by-step process on the side of every product so there's no hassle and decision making when using it. It'll slot into your routine like clockwork. So jump in now and get 100% off your skincare trial set and a free gift of choice. All you have to do is pay shipping and you'll receive $50 worth of skincare products and a free gift of your choice in every order, plus 50% off add-ons like their shampoo and shower gel. Thanks again to Geology, and back to the lore. So, returning to the topic at hand. How did we get here? And what did I actually want to talk about? I wanted to break down not just what it's been like being a fan of Destiny over the years, talking about the highs and lows, but I also wanted to talk about the nature of being a fan of something generally in this day and age. To put it bluntly, I think that being a fan of something sucks, and I think we need to ask ourselves the question of why it's allowed to become that way. So today I'm going to talk about my 5 highest highs within the game, and the 5 points at which it has been the lowest lows of the game. And along the way, we'll be talking about all the rest. We'll be talking about why things became toxic and how we as a community got here, how things changed, how things, for brief moments, got better, and how there were also points at which everything crashed. I want to talk about why. I want to talk about the change in momentum and the mental shifts that I at very least experienced, and I think I saw within the rest of the community. 10 years worth of experience means that some of this is going to be imperfect. Some of it's not going to apply to all of you. Some of you may look at it and may gawk your eyes at these perspectives and opinions because you'll never believe that times like these existed. I'm sure that Destiny 1 pre-release anecdote has some of you rolling your eyes thinking, oh, how naive could he be? And yet, that's exactly where we were at the time. I wasn't alone. I was a part of a community. And we all had the same feeling. This is a bit of a journey through time. But it's also my perspective, generally, so if you were there and you did have a different perspective of it all, let me know about it. I can't speak to what your opinions are of Destiny, but I can speak to mine. Lord knows that outside of Destiny 1, I did not have an opinion on the nature of PvP for much of the franchise, for example. So, yeah, feel free to disagree at any particular point and to state that maybe this was the time at X seasonal launch or X expansion that Destiny really started to go downhill. I imagine there'll be a lot of notions and mentions of Beyond Light. I imagine there'll be a lot of mentions of a lot of bad moments in time. So yeah, if you're in a place to disagree, let me know, because mine is just a perspective. The first real high and low for the games, well, they're what I just touched on. The pre-release of Destiny and its near disastrous launch. Following these events, however, there was still a sense of resoluteness to the game. Bungie had proclaimed in their pre-release marketing that they'd be working on Destiny for the next decade. We also had no clue what kind of stuff to expect from a new Destiny expansion, and the Dark Below was right around the corner. I know thanks to old interviews of employees at Bungie having spoken about this time period that At the launch of Destiny Vanilla, there was a short window of time where things could get done for the Dark Below. An insane, crunchy push had to be finished up in order to get the Dark Below expansion out. And whilst it wasn't completely untouched at the start, it did still mean that it was threadbare. The priorities of the teams had seemingly been made clear, at least by some early community sentiment and by their own objectives. Ensure that they got the raid Crota's End out with the expansion release. Get what could be created of a story campaign out. Add some new content for the community. That was mostly it. With the exception of Crota's End, this was not a positive time within the community at large. This was the first point at which the outlook for the game was truly bleak. And at first, they did leave. Granted, lots of them reinstalled at certain points in time, but it started the trend. And it felt as though it was sort of taking the toothpaste out of the tube. When it had been done once, it couldn't be taken back. In a certain sense, the Dark Below's failure was its own, but in another sense it was the failure compounded by the further problems of Destiny's vanilla release. The game we had been promised was so very different from what we had in our hands. We had envisioned things as though we might get a first-person shooter World of Warcraft. We believed the scale of an expansion might be enormous. And suddenly it had become plain as day to us all that this was not going to be the case. The universe had amazing lore, but the story felt threadbare and poorly thought out. The PvP side of the game got new maps with the Dark Below, but we also saw the first of many instances where the meta started to sharpen as the population inevitably began to dwindle. The Crota's End raid had shown us that Destiny had a unique selling point, endgame experiences that gave longevity over other games. But equally, the PvE content at the time being, strikes and maybe a few story missions, well, it really wasn't that fun. It was honestly kind of terrible. And furthermore, when it came down to these new strikes, some of them amounted to little more than campaign missions run in reverse. This was a moment as a fan that I think taught me to temper my expectations of what could happen in a big release. It was also one of the first times that I decided to stubbornly ignore something that the game was telling me. In front of my eyes, there was a ton of evidence that the game wasn't great, particularly with a lacking story and a very, very bad day-to-day grind. Instead, I endeavored to focus on the things that I did enjoy. I still loved the Crucible at the time. Raids were still fun to run with friends, and were a key part of the leveling to max experience anyway and chasing any leftover exotics I had. Nightfall strikes back in Destiny 1 had become a little more manageable, and we were starting to demonstrate our early mastery of the game, even if it was just everyone hiding in a corridor to shoot at Fogoth and Valastar Ark. And then, there was the lore. Destiny's early lore wasn't in the game, but for those that went delving into those mines on Bungie.net, there were gems to be found. Stories of the Great Disaster, the whispered legends of the first fire teams to raid the Vault of Glass or storm the Hellmouth. Strange heroes like Osiris and Saint who had seemed so very far from our everyday experience on the game, and yet they also drew so much attention and inspiration just from who they were and what they had done. And of course, the one that always pulls me back in, stories of dragons, even if they had been hunted to extinction. We had been taught that our games sucked. The general gaming community had truly started to turn on Destiny, with the commentary of it being a dead game starting to ring throughout the general gaming crowd. If it wasn't for the sake of passionate players, I think those loud cries would have honestly overwhelmed it all. But to those of us playing it, there was a core to the game that was magical, that all of us were enjoying in spite of everything telling us we shouldn't. This felt like the first of many tests of faith. A test of faith that was eventually rewarded when the first real high of Destiny came into focus. The first of my 5 moments where things were good. The Taken King. For many people, this is where Destiny actually started. The game was reworked and overhauled to become closer to the RPG that players wanted. We didn't have the kind of wild additions that we'd see in later iterations of the game, but we saw some of the first times when Bungie threw everything at the wall, and it just so happened that almost all of it stuck. The story nowadays seems relatively basic compared to the stuff we get in Destiny today, but it was marvelous compared to what had come before. Oryx was a character whispered about in the lore that had manifested in-game, a terrifying, tyrannical, taken king, with all of the terrible caveats of his rumored power, proving that he was worthy of that whispered fear that his name had inspired. The Crucible also saw new maps, a massive number of new maps in fact. A renaissance of player engagement had also seen its way into the game, as players were coming back to see this new story unfold, and the game felt fresh with new strikes, and of course 3 new subclasses. The new Dreadnought destination was filled with secrets designed to delight the hardcore player base, and is to this day one of the more beloved destinations in the franchise's history, even if it only briefly returned to us in Heresy just recently. And then of course there was King's Fall. Considered to be the best of the Destiny 1 raids, it brought a scale and grandeur to the endgame that had never been seen before. The game's general perception shifted completely, and I think it's fair to say that it was incredibly popular at the time. I mean, just look at the stats. Years later, Datto's Touch of Malice video has over 6 million views. 6 million. For a guide on how to acquire a raid exotic. Doing that kind of viewership on any video nowadays, I mean, it'd be unheard of for even the largest content creators. This was a time when the game was allowed to have secrets as well, and the community reached for them gleefully. We didn't expect them. We were surprised by them. But there was a little bit of a dark twist to all of this, because as humans, we do start to recognize patterns in things. I think that for Destiny 1 veterans, the game's secrets would rarely hit as big after this point in time, with maybe a few exceptions in the entire history of the franchise that would reflect the same level of hype that we had on the Dreadnought. The Black Spindle mission is a great example of this, as well as its later descendant in the Whisper of the Worm. Outbreak Prime's discovery in Rise of Iron as a massive puzzle had to be unlocked using binary and all sorts of madness. The hunt for the wishes in Forsaken, maybe something to do with what happened in Season of Dawn. There were some times when secrets were allowed to exist in Destiny, and we didn't necessarily rate them as a part of the overall experience. They felt like something more, something additional, something transcendent, something beyond the game itself. Now, whenever a secret is discovered, it's discovered fast and through the use of data mining. Nothing is allowed to be a mystery anymore. The rat race of people trying to get the content done and creators trying to make content on it has left us all bereft of the novelty and surprise that such a moment might provide. Regardless, this was one of the highs of Destiny, because it showed us something really important. At its best, the game wasn't just good, it was great. At its best, Destiny was a place that inspired wonder. At its best, Destiny was a game which could do something which nothing else did. Raids showed us that. For me, the lore showed me that. And I think for anyone who played back in those days, the community showed us that. The lack of content after Taken King did hit hard and eventually led to the April update, but through all of this time, the community had begun to quietly galvanize into something. It was shortly before the Taken King and everything that it brought that early streaming communities were starting to form. I remember that this was the first time I met my peers in the industry in the US. Donated Jake, Gathalion, Professor Broman, and many others were all a part of this big, extended Destiny family. I still remember what it was like to go to the first ever iteration of GCX, also known as GuardianCon, also known as DestinyCon, also known back in that first instance as SweatCon. Those days, somewhere in a bar in Tampa, where I definitely wasn't underage for the US at the time and definitely didn't sneak into the Irish bar with my friends afterwards. It was the first time I'd gotten to meet the community at large. It was the first time that I felt like I was a part of something which was bigger than me, a part of a greater family. And that time, well, it was beyond special. If I could replay all the best times of mine that I had in the community, many of them would be to do with GCX, or the conventions, or the meetups that we had. I think it's here that I also learned something more about the way that we see fandom generally. You see, the game was so much more when you could meet up with fans in person more freely and more easily. Social media was an avenue by which you could do that, but ultimately it felt like it was this mainline extension that ultimately led to places like GCX, to meetups in person where you could actually form a proper, tangible friendship with someone, where it would transcend just a voice over comms. Nowadays, the majority of the discussion that we get around games comes from social media, but if you go to a convention and understand what that personable connection is like on the other side, you know the buzz and hype that exists in a space like that, where you're all brought together by something that gives you common joy. You're a part of something bigger that you all partake in. But that's changed ever since the pandemic and since traveling has gotten more difficult in recent years. We're in this strange place now where the world is further away than it used to be. We're now frequently locked into our phones, where we're more likely to fall prey to our frustrations and engage other players with those frustrations to unleash them upon others. We're no longer engaging with the things that delight us, we're engaging with the things that give us grief instead. Those early days, back in Destiny's vanilla and Taken King era, they remind me of times when such horrors didn't necessarily exist. Twitter in these times was a place where we went for fun and community building. Now that Old Town Square feels like a far more extreme place, where instead of a more casual playground, we're left with the best and worst of all things that can be, where normality and the general hubbub of excitement isn't necessarily welcome. Not for gaming, not for something where you can be passionate about things. It feels as though it's the same for Destiny. Maybe it's the same for all gaming communities. When extreme instances of anything rise to the top, nobody cares that you just got the legendary weapon you've just been chasing for such a long time. The small things that we all celebrated stopped mattering. It was only the massive dubs that were really celebrated. And everything else started to fall into what was generally seen as either mediocrity, or alternatively, something that should be spoken out about, something that should be hated. Sometimes this was earned, but oftentimes it just wasn't, because I feel like we were bored. But for a time, things did feel different from this. They felt good. And in the aftermath of the Taken King, that galvanizing push that I talked about, where the community started to stand together, it made us really push towards Destiny 2 Vanilla and its eventual release with a renewed zeal. I was actually invited out to the premiere of Destiny 2 in California, and I remember it being a great time as well. I screamed myself hoarse with excitement as I watched us prepare for a new era of the game. Much as it's seen as a disaster now, this is actually one of my second periods at which everything was quite good. And I think people forget about that because Destiny 2 at the time being, for the first 6 or so weeks of its release, genuinely felt like it was an incredible game at an incredible time. And to be really clear, it was, at its initial outing, kind of just worse than Destiny 1. The game didn't have better guns and was a more simplistic version of Destiny 1, and all these things were bad about it. But it wasn't so much about the game, it was about the community and the people around it. We were all so content with the hyped place that we were in that, well, we treated everything in Destiny as a success. I remember that in the first weeks or so I saw Reddit threads where the only complaint that they had was that we had a limited number of uses per shader, with commentary within the same thread saying that, yeah, it was a problem, but it was kind of incredible that that was the only complaint we had about the game at the time. If this second of my 5 high points in the history of the game had taught me anything, it was simply that a game's vibe is entirely different from how good it actually is. Judging Edge of Fate versus Destiny 2 Vanilla reveals a game that is vastly more complex and solid compared to what it was 8 years ago, with a deeper and more rewarding and engaging sandbox, with enemies that are more fun to fight, weapons that are more fun to shoot, a campaign that tells a better story than it did back in the day. And yet, the difference is the context of time. I think that the community back in the days of Destiny 2 Vanilla had seen the 3 years prior to that moment as Bungie learning to get it right, and now as the review scores seemed to file in and confirm that bias, we were able to celebrate. Bungie had finally done it, we had persisted through the bad, and now we could be met with the good. And that was the story we told ourselves. Because we lived it. For about 4 weeks, 6 weeks. but it was the more perceptive players like SkillUp who voiced their concerns at the time. He was certain that the greatness that Destiny 1 had eventually found over its 3-year run had frankly run out, and, well, that greatness had been lost. SkillUp was right, of course, because after those first 6 weeks or so of Destiny 2's lifespan, controversy began to rear its ugly head again. XP throttling, and players complaining about the nature of the game, and saying, what happened to the complexity of what we expected in Destiny 1? Where's all the content? How come it's so shallow compared to what it used to be? And why is the time to kill in the Crucible so weird, and what have you done with our special weapons? Why are they in the heavy slot? As Destiny 2 Vanilla's lifespan started to seed into its first expansion, and that controversy began to reappear, we went from the second of my highest of highs, and we fell back into one of the lowest of lows in the entire history of the franchise, with Curse of Osiris. This expansion isn't remembered fondly. The story was strange, meandering, and whilst it explored interesting characters and concepts in the lore, it didn't explore them in a way that people enjoyed. Osiris was essentially there for 1.5 missions. The game's major problems had not been addressed, even with the addition of the procedurally generated Infinite Forest, which quickly became far too familiar to its players. The raid had become much more simplified as an endeavor as well, and had been smaller than what we had expected in the form of Crota's End or Wrath of the Machine. The sandbox had not evolved past its pointless armor and single perk static weapon rolls. And then of course there was the most infamous moment of all that took place before the expansion even released, where community manager Deej remarked about the game's new most rewarding public event ever. Oof. To this day, if I say the phrase 2 tokens and a blue, people know it as a meme born of a really dark time in Destiny's life cycle. The comedy of such a moment was underscored by a sudden realization that Bungie seemed to not understand everything that made their first game brilliant. It was like a different studio was making it now. Like different people were at the helm. If this was Bungie's idea of what was rewarding, we were screwed, because nobody cared about 2 tokens and a blue. Of course, the real failure here is actually with the thinking that brought Destiny 2 Vanilla to us. It was a failure to understand what had worked about Destiny at its core, and at least for me, it was the first time that Bungie had revealed a degree of tone deafness within their own game principles and design. This was the first time when I listened to the points of everyone saying that the game was dead, and wondered aloud, well, are they actually right this time? Most people won't be able to pinpoint a specific moment when that happened. But for me, that doubt, that first moment of real doubt, happened here. The game we loved felt like it had evaporated before our eyes, because Bungie hadn't actually taken the correct lessons from Destiny and all of the missteps they'd made along the way that led them eventually to greatness. And as that game that we loved had evaporated before our eyes, we'd all woken up to the fact that we had become instantly distrusting of Bungie's management. Trust between the community and the studio would continue to ebb and flow over the years, but I think this felt like the first time when it really was tested to an extreme. After everything we'd gone through with Destiny 1, it felt as though we had just gone backwards. And that felt incredibly demoralizing. The game was back to being in that lowest possible state, but the lack of trust really began to get felt a lot more throughout the discourse of the game. It's worth noting that this was when I first started to see more clear and prominent examples of the unfortunate trend of developers being harassed more in bad times. To be really clear, because that could potentially cover a few different possibilities, I'm not talking about moments of critique or calling out bugs or asking for the game to be fixed. I'm also not referring to mean-spirited comments, although those certainly do see a marked increase in bad times as well. No, I'm talking about real harassment. This is the first time I kept hearing from studio employees about how they had more death threats than usual, and how they were more afraid of being doxxed than they would be normally. I feel like something had seriously shifted at this point within the community and its mindset. SkillUp's later review of Forsaken remarked that at the time of the Curse of Osiris, the community was in mourning for the game that they'd lost, and honestly, yeah, it felt like we were all at a wake for about 8 months or so. Beyond the low mood, I think the loss of trust and the fraying sense of community had led to the most socially maladapted to decide that now was the time to make their displeasure known in the more dangerous ways they could muster. Outliers though they may be, this trend still happens to this day, and unfortunately it's nothing new in gaming generally. Nobody claims these people. Let's be incredibly clear about that. No one in their right mind sits there and says, "Wow, how based is he for sending a death threat?" I think it's also kind of a sad reflection on my own part that this is the first time when I really started to take serious notice of it, because, well, yeah, this stuff has happened in gaming for years, well before the time of Curse of Osiris. This was just the point at which I started to notice a visible uptick in those stories emerging. Putting aside these kind of idiots that I'm sure nobody in their right mind is championing, and I would never accuse any of you of doing so, it all emerged out of a climate that nobody could quite control. The vibes were down. We were all listless at the time being. That is not to excuse their actions, they're all bastards. What I will say about it though is just that I think we all felt like we didn't have direction, like there wasn't really a voice that was guiding Destiny in the right direction that it needed. And in that kind of place, bad actors find a way to make room for themselves. But all of this would eventually get better. And it would start to get better with the arrival of one of the greatest expansions in Destiny's history, which was of course Forsaken. I remember this time with some trepidation and a lot of remorse on the personal front. I burned out really hard in Forsaken, and I don't want to go into the personal reasons of why, and it certainly is something that isn't relevant to this video either, because my burning out at this time was nothing to do with the game itself. After the last year or so that we'd had, finally returning to something that seemed as though it was worthy of the greatness that we all knew Destiny was capable of, it was wonderful. It was great. The community rallied, and whilst there was still a great renewal of interest and trust in Destiny within all aspects of the game, we also saw a moment where the community learned to be much more critical of Bungie, and started to take much more note about the moments when they slipped. The trust had started to evaporate here. For context, I think that there is actually a huge amount of benefit to this attitude shift. Critical feedback within the industry makes the industry better. The critical feedback that we give to developers, if they are listening and enacting those changes, takes time, but inevitably it makes games better, because even though development timelines take months and not minutes, if we can see a problem and we can communicate it to the devs, yeah, it's a good thing. It will make the game a better game. But with that critical sense of things, we also shed a little bit of the last innocence that we had from the early days of Destiny. Our relationship to the studio fundamentally changed, I feel. Instead of feeling like just fans or even collaborators in the shared creation of the game that we loved, the community started to see things in a different, more transactional manner. And again, I think some of that is actually important and healthy, especially in a world where big corporations try desperately every day to call piss rain. But I'd be lying if I didn't say that it was also killing what was left of that early magic feeling, the feeling that made games fun. Now it feels like people find their fun by pointing out the smaller issues with the game, rather than by having fun by playing the game itself. But for what it's worth, Forsaken was a fun time to play Destiny, even if the commitment we had to put into the power grind was just a little bit insane. And I say that as one person who for a brief shining moment was the third highest light level in the entire game, only behind Grenada Jake and one other person whose name I sadly can't remember. Forsaken was a great time to be a Destiny player. We reignited our love of the game, and there were many things to be excited about, from a great story that told a compelling narrative that we could all latch onto, with secrets that were just everywhere within the Dreaming City and Tangled Shore, and of course, with the greatest raid up until that point in the game's history. The Dreaming City and the evolving story in Forsaken in the times after the release of Forsaken's main content cycle, it laid the foundations of what made future seasonal stories great, and in this time Bungie was given room to experiment and add new things to the game, such as Gambit and the first ever dungeon in the form of Shattered Throne, and proper in-game lore books and triumphs. The lore tabs are great for me in particular, of course, and, well, let's be real. The moment that I saw that lore books were a thing and that there was a chronicler title associated with them, I knew exactly what I was going to do for the next few months. Bungie had embraced the same lessons that they had been taught back in the Taken King, which, to condense it all and grossly simplify it, amounted to the simple idea of, If you take care of the core community and listen to them, they'll take care of you. It was something that they'd really have to cherish too, because the next steps on their journey would lead them into uncharted waters. Independence. They split off from Activision. It also led to Shadowkeep and Beyond Light, two expansions that for some represent a downturn in the game, but which I see with a more balanced view. Yes, there are certainly bad things that happened, but I understand it as a point in time when Destiny had to evolve, and where clearly there were some big growing pains. For everything that was added that could be considered good, such as the much improved seasons and the implementation of new subclasses like Stasis, we also saw disastrous choices, such as the ever-disastrous choice to sunset parts of the game. Whilst the damage of that particular decision isn't something that should be understated, I think it's important to remember that it's not representative of a singular low, even if it was something that haunts the game and the player base to this day. And I say that because it was a mixed time playing both these expansions. There was a lot of questioning. People didn't exactly know what Bungie's place with independence would look like. And I think it's also fair to say that at the time being, it was also sold to us as a kind of balancing act, where it was a necessary evil. They had to remove the Tangled Shore, Io, and Titan, purely on the basis that if they didn't, they wouldn't have enough room to add all the other stuff that they were going to need to in the future. And at that point, well, the decision had been made long ago. For me, I was invested in the success of the game at this point, because I'd always been there for the ride, and I was part of that metaphorical furniture around the game's community. At this point, I really was the lore guy, and at this point I was starting to make my bigger recap videos. The Shadowkeep one in particular has gone on to make 15 million views as of the making of this video, which was always growing in the background and acted as a sort of consistent reminder that even if there were some ups and downs in the game, the community was always there. There were always going to be ups and downs, especially headed into the pandemic, but the community had now carved out its own section of the internet, and we were mostly stable and content within our own little section. Bungie also chose to release a roadmap around about the release of Beyond Light, which in general terms announced the shape of the next 3 years and the expansions that they planned to release, in the form of Beyond Light, The Witch Queen, and Lightfall. It felt like things were building towards something that would again validate our faith in Bungie, and as the seasons of The Hunt, Chosen, Splicer, and Lost rolled into view, we got a look at a story that was better than it had ever been ahead of the next real high, Witch Queen. I know some look back on Witch Queen with a fair degree of skepticism, but I think it's important to understand just how much this did for Destiny. The game had been maligned for years, partly because there was no story really worth caring about. Destiny had always been thought of as, I don't have time to explain what I don't have time to explain, even after the release of Destiny 2 Vanilla with a markedly better campaign, even after there had been several expansions, and Forsaken had told a pretty good story too. But then, nothing had had the same kind of impact on that general idea of what Destiny could be. Until in strolled Savathun the Witch Queen, and suddenly it felt like it was an entirely different game. We were suddenly shown a possible future where Destiny not only had awesome lore, but also a story that had the potential to drive the game's popularity all on its own. All of this also culminated with the greater pivot to the arrival of the real enemies of darkness within the franchise at large, with the arrival of the Black Fleet's ultimate commander, the Witness. Whilst they certainly looked strange and the reception to this megamind-looking fellow was initially a little bit hesitant, there was a real sense of purpose that the appearance of the Witness had given us. We had seen the face of our true enemy, and soon it'd be time to go and get them. I think this is important to understand for the context of what went correctly next and what would also soon go wrong. The Witness was a lightning rod. It was the focus for the story, and it gave people the overarching push to stick around in those years because it was part of the 10-year narrative that had become tangible. It was the tip of the spear that we were about to fight. In hindsight, it seems clear that the first few years of the Light and Dark saga involved a lot of aimless meandering, but for the Destiny player base, it's hard to understate how much hype this put into the entire community. I would know. I have tangible proof of it. Behind the launch of Destiny 2 and the month in which that happened, the month where Witch Queen launched represents the best month on YouTube in my channel's entire lifetime. Esoteric lore nonsense in Destiny was so good that month that it garnered nearly 6 million views for me, and I had to stop making content at a certain point in time to take a rest. I bring that up not because this was new. There'd always been interesting lore in Destiny, otherwise I wouldn't have a channel. I bring it up because Witch Queen and the seasons leading up to it had turbocharged the interest not just in the lore but in Destiny's main story in a way that I haven't seen since. People used to stick around for the Crucible and the raids, and they still did, even with the Crucible not receiving any new maps for years, and with some of the raids having been sunset, including fan favorites like Spire of Stars and Crown of Sorrow. But now people were sticking around to see what the story was each week and how it went each week. There was a new pillar upon which Destiny could stand, and it was the campaign. The story was now good. It was worth doing. Bungie was making new strides with it. But as it goes with anything invoking pride, and as the saying says, pride cometh before the fall. And this represents the next major point at which Destiny saw its next big downturn. And does it really need any introduction? I don't think it does. I think it's fair to say that with the benefit of hindsight, Lightfall was where it all started to go pear-shaped. I think we're still recovering from the damage this expansion did to the player base. It started what, in my mind, was the true decline of modern Destiny, and it led to a moment where, as a fan, there was a horrifying question that I started to ask myself. Was Witch Queen a fluke? I'd felt like Bungie had hit their stride, at least in broader senses, with Witch Queen generally. The narrative around how the game was viewed was changing. People had heard that the Witch Queen campaign was excellent to the point where it was actually a rave review kind of situation. It wasn't going to become Game of the Year, but Destiny was in a different place. There was actually a changing general sense around the game, and I think that Bungie could sense this too, because ultimately this began a push in their marketing, a massive push which led up to Lightfall and saw dozens of creators from other games in the general gaming space being invited in with sponsorships to try the game for themselves. And when they got in, they were greeted with Lightfall's campaign. Oh boy. I don't want to dog on this one too much. First of all, it's been done to death. Secondly, there are some people who actually really do enjoy Lightfall's campaign for its light-hearted attitude and action movie vibes. But as a Destiny fan, I knew that I was horribly disappointed. All the nuance and praise and well-crafted narrative moments that made the Witch Queen's story stand in stark contrast to everything that we got with Lightfall. It aimed to sell us an Avengers Infinity War story, with our heroes finally losing against the big bad before having to rally so that they could win the final battle. Unfortunately, it also refused to explain key narrative elements that made that loss impactful or even understandable. I still get asked to this day, by the way, what the Veil is, just so we're really clear about what we're talking about. And then, of course, there was the first time in recent memory that the raid was disappointing. Root of Nightmares was one of the easiest raids in the franchise's history, which was great for first-timers, but this was not a time for first-timers. This was the penultimate raid of the Light and Dark saga as best we knew. This was the time to delight and enthuse and challenge endgame players, and it just didn't do any of those things. For a pinnacle endgame Destiny PvE activity, raiders were able to complete this thing that they'd prepped for the entire year in the space of about 2 hours. That's disappointing compared to some of the other longer stints, where some raids have taken as long as 6, and where Koragos, at least on the non-epic version most recently, took well over 15 or 16 if I'm not mistaken. I talked just a few moments ago about how Destiny has pillars within the game itself that hold up the community's love for it, and with Lightfall 2 of those pillars were thoroughly sundered. The raid and the narrative. And there was a third pillar in the form of the Crucible being left to wither even further. There were some good additions to the game in Lightfall. There were quality of life improvements, such as loadouts, and there were fun additions to the sandbox, along with Strand, and it made the game feel somewhat more alive. They were not enough to patch the wounds left on the community's withering trust. To this day, I wonder if there was a reason for why all of these decisions were made. Reading into leaks and articles citing the internal politics of Bungie over the years will paint a picture of a studio that was expanding at the behest of its executives so fast in the digital COVID boom. Perhaps much too fast, as not one but a whole handful of incubation projects were being started and worked on across the studio at the same time, even as Destiny team members were being pulled from their duties so they could work on these projects, even as Destiny was the only thing giving the studio any revenue. Only one of these incubation projects will actually see the light of day by the looks of things, and that's Marathon. Maybe there will be another one, assuming it's not cancelled by Sony, but at the moment, Marathon is still not looking great, and it has its own controversy, well-deserved, and a fair share of problems stemming from the early closed alpha. But that's a separate video that I've already talked about. Even to this day, I still wonder how much blame can be laid at the feet of Pete Parsons, the then CEO. It's a topic that has been talked about endlessly by myself and others, and whilst yes, it is a dead Mustang as I referred to it earlier, I'll happily still beat that dead horse, even though I fear it makes very little difference now. As a fan of the game, I personally am glad he's gone. Leaders should lead, and I fear that he and the rest of the leadership team at Bungie are responsible for putting Destiny in the state that it's in thanks to decisions made back in those days, even as the day-to-day developers were desperately trying to save it. Because it seems to me like the start cutscene and the end cutscene of Lightfall are, as people reported, just part of the same thing, split apart, used to top and tail a campaign that was built because of demand, not because of creative endeavor. Because I don't believe that any narrative team would be mad enough to choose to split off the explanation of the Veil, something which according to the story was so important and yet was never explained. I certainly don't think they'd be mad enough to split off that explanation for the season following that unless they were forced to. Because I don't believe that the tonal shift of Lightfall's final marketing from its early marketing came out of nowhere. Maybe it was to inflate the company's value ahead of the Sony acquisition. Maybe I'm wrong and it was all just bad decision-making from across the studio. We may only ever be able to guess at this point, but those guesses don't change how I felt as a player. I felt disappointed. I felt betrayed. And the community, well, I think everyone in it mostly felt the same. Yeah, there were some who sat there and enjoyed Lightfall, and this is no way of digging at them and saying that they're wrong, because it's an opinion, you're allowed to have one. But I got the greater sense that we'd seen a point of rot now. The player base, I think, could sense it. People had already been tired out over the years with Bungie not delivering consistently, and with the 10-year journey approaching its end, many were planning to make their exit when the journey itself did conclude. The greatest sin of Lightfall was it showed the fans that were going to leave the exit, and gave them compelling reasons to not return beyond the next expansion, the final shape. It was already a pretty bad time, and then the next season dropped, and it still wasn't great, even if the season's content itself was actually alright. And maybe the game could have bounced back again, if it wasn't for Season of the Witch. To be really clear, I actually really loved Season of the Witch, and I think it was received really well. I personally believe it to be one of Bungie's best seasonal outings as far as the narrative is concerned. To simplify it all, stuff actually happened. Eris Morn's story arc hit a new high, and we saw the Hive evolve even further, which only continues to reinforce the trend that if it's a Hive story in Destiny, there's some really good cook going on there. But then came the thing that really made Season of the Witch such a bad season. It wasn't actually anything to do with the season. It was the layoffs, and the final shape delay. Granted, the delay was bad, but we were used to delays, and it was manageable. The layoffs, on the other hand, were a moment where Bungie's leadership let the mask slip and then decided to just take it off entirely. They showed us what really mattered to them, I feel. I don't know about you all, but from my perspective, the damage that this moment did to the community cannot be understated, and it may well have been irreparable. People were already critical of Bungie, but with this moment, the idea of what Bungie was actively changed, and not just for us in the community, but for people who heard about Bungie from afar, who were just gamers out there in the general community landscape, who weren't actually truly attached to the game in any meaningful sense, but who could be prospective future players who might consider picking Destiny up. For those who cared about the nuance and wished to see it, it felt as though there was a pool of developers that were being held hostage by a leadership team hell-bent on making their big payday for when their shares would vest and they would be able to exit to fabulous luxury. For those that didn't, and who were part of the wider gaming audience, Bungie had changed from the company that made Halo, one of the games that they had loved, to the company run by some faceless entity called Pete Parsons, aka the guy with the garage full of cars. Asking who the CEO of Bungie is today will probably still elicit the response of, isn't it that car guy, right? There are so many moments where CEO greed in the gaming industry generally has screwed so many different franchises, and it's clear as day to see. Pete Parsons was one I really hoped would never join that list. And for the Destiny community at large, and for anyone who proclaimed to be a fan of the game, once again, it was back to that corner of shame for anyone who was a fan of Destiny. And I really do mean shame. I think it was Datto at the time who expressed this well enough, and told everybody what it was like to be a Destiny fan or creator within the wider world of gaming. I get the sense that Destiny has long been seen as a constantly dying thing that everyone awkwardly tolerates as it struggles with itself in the corner of the room. For all the things I love and hate about the IP, I think there's no way to break through the general gaming populace and talk about what has changed and where the game really is, at least not for the moment, because everyone's mind has been made up. I feel as a fan that it's impossible for me to communicate what's good about Destiny without having to say, yeah, it's the game with the car CEO. I mean, he's gone now, but yeah, he did spend $2.4 million on classic cars, according to that one website that tracked his account. Yeah, he is gone now, but he was CEO when there was this massive slew of points at which racism, sexism, and homophobia were being condemned at the company and were being found out, and where the reports were being made live on IGN. You know, it's totally that game. Yeah, Destiny. This is the game that I play. Do you understand how embarrassing that is? How embarrassing it still is? Like, I mean, there are tons of companies out there that have terrible CEOs and games with bad cultures, but for some reason with Destiny it just sticks so much more vilely. Lightfall was the tipping point, but the layoffs that followed told us more about those leading Bungie than any single expansion or season or little update did ever before. I still remember how my blood boiled at reading that the question of whether bonuses would be cut to help save on costs was brought up, so that maybe fewer people might need to be laid off, and the response from the company was, "This is not that kind of company." Despite Bungie being a company that called itself a family, despite the projected image of the studio as being one of the few that had bucked the great layoff trend of 2023, despite them wrangling to fix a studio culture that was still littered with creeps from the past generation that were rightly dismissed. Despite all these claims and all these attempts to do the right thing, it looked as though it was entirely self-serving, and that the leadership was about as similar as anything we'd seen from some other terrible CEO of a company that really didn't care about anything but the bottom line. Bungie had presented itself as a family, and CEO Pete Parsons and the executive team were clearly supposedly also a part of that family. Or at least, they were. No, that image of something worth fighting for was firmly left dead by the leadership team that refused to put their team and the long-term health of the company before themselves and their own personal gain. Before this point, maybe the company had a heart and soul. After this point, I'm sure it did, but it feels a lot harder to believe it. I still believe that the individuals working hard at Bungie, the developers who actually make the magic of the game, can continue to hold the soul of Bungie in their hands. I just also know that there's an executive team there that wasn't willing to look out for them when the goings got tough. And I will remind everyone that assuming it was thanks to the overinvestment in various different projects that never came to be, that they were the ones who put them in that position of jeopardy in the first place. Bungie is of course now being integrated more closely with Sony, and they no longer have the same CEO that they did. Now their VP, their studio head, is Justin Truman. Time will tell if Justin is able to right the ship. But more on that later. Because from here in our timeline, yeah, Destiny evolves into more of the game that I know it to be today. The potential is still there for it to be great. There's still magic to be found in this world, but you have to constantly squint harder and harder for it. And then there's the knock-on effects of the layoffs, not just this round, but also the next one. With fewer developers and an executive team who, in my opinion, seemed to have shown their priorities of greed, Bungie's employees soldiered on, but the impacts of all those layoffs would start to impact the quality of the content that was being released. We wouldn't really see this until, well, now-ish. Maybe around the episodes when there wasn't a second raid being launched or re-released. But we would slowly start to see the game recede as more and more studio members left Bungie. This also breaks us into another important topic that's adjacent to all of this, which is the nuance of it all. And simply put, at this time the Destiny community was downright nasty. There were some people who had really started to become loud, who seemingly even to this day are allergic to the idea that you can love something and hate parts of it at the same time. There are some who will be completely unwilling to accept that there's a more complex picture than something that you can sum up in a tweet. Hell, this video is running long already. As I'm recording this and haven't cut down the audio, it's approaching an hour and a half. However, even this video is going to be missing out massive pieces of broader context and parts to the puzzle that are important. But to an extent, none of that matters to some people who are out there on social media, because there will be a single comment somewhere on any post nowadays which will somehow refute everything anyone has to say about the game and will reduce it to being terrible without so much as a paragraph of explanation. To be really clear as well, I'm not talking about something like Glad's thoroughly thought-out post from the other day, where he decided to not partake in the epic raid and talked about why. I'm talking about the 10,000 unknown Andys of Twitter whose posts amount to a selection of the words for dog and excrement, in that order. Not critique, not suggestions, not a well-thought-out post, just salt for the sake of salt. Now sure, critique on its own, as I said earlier, might steal a little bit of the magic from the game, but I also stated earlier that it's actually a really good thing for the game. It improves the game. It might lead to the game becoming better. But the constant, unending salt? Yeah, that's different. I think this is the point at which I started to hate the discourse around the game that I loved, the game that I played, the game that I did often have issues with, the game that I was often frustrated with. And I'm not alone. It's this discourse that can't possibly celebrate the victories of the game, but will happily elevate every single loss. The discourse that has become actively hostile to any developer or any community member at large that happens to voice an opinion that isn't immediate dissent to the point of anger and vitriol and calling for someone to lose their job. And I started to see this particular kind of commentary really amplify around about Lightfall. You know what made me stop reading all of my comments section? It was my final critique of Lightfall. Not the first critique where I said, hey, my 24 hours in review is telling me that this is kind of a big disappointment. No, this was me talking about Lightfall after having done all of the content associated with it. In that same video, within the same page's worth of comments, literally almost next to each other, I saw one comment calling me a shill and another stating that I was just hate farming. All on the video where I'd been genuinely trying to do neither, all right next to each other. But this is the reality of being a fan of something today on the internet. Your opinions are subject to critique. Your critique is subject to critique. You have to have the right opinion on a piece of media. Not too good, so as to not be called a shill, and not too bad as to not be accused of hate farming. This has only been amplified by the devolution of Twitter as our local internet town square, where we all fled to during the pandemic. It's a terrible place now, filled with people who spend far too much time on social media and who have become miserable and insular as a result. Not exactly a revolutionary take, is it? Twitter is awful, I'm sure you know. But it's the way that this has seeped into our day-to-day discourse that's so worrying. I was around 10 years ago. We weren't as attached to Twitter. We used to be better. We used to be capable of having fun. Most importantly of all, we used to be capable of detaching from these digital spaces and playing games for fun. And, for what it's worth, I think we were also kinder. Not like we all need to necessarily be kind, but it would be nice to be courteous, even so courteous as to not call for someone to be fired or not dox them. Again, I don't claim that that's everyone. I'm sure all of us agree those people are sociopaths. But the point is this: the digital space that we all occupy became more hostile. It just became worse. Back in the day, when something wasn't fun, we put the game down and came back to it when it was. Or we played something else that we enjoyed. Curse of Osiris came around. You know what I did? I didn't make Destiny videos for a while. I played Monster Hunter instead. Because that's the normal thing to do. Games are meant to be fun after all. And yet in the horrifying dystopian town square that Twitter has become, we seem to have forgotten that. I've talked about it a lot in my streams, but I think we all need to have a healthier relationship with the media that we consume. If you don't like something, nobody is forcing you to engage with it. But the discourse on Twitter surrounding video games is a place where that concept has started to become completely alien to people. There's now this weird subset of people who have either never played the games they're complaining about, or who have completely uninstalled them long ago and yet still complain. And excuse my language here, but honestly, that shit is baffling to me. If you hate something to the point where you've uninstalled it, and you've unhitched yourself from that thing that you dislike, why are you still talking about it? It is no longer something that affects you, so why are you bringing it back into your life? The healthy and sane thing to do is to move on to something you do enjoy, and to spend your energy enjoying that. So why is Destiny in such a weird place of being a thing that so many people complain about after they've proclaimed to have uninstalled it, and haven't played it for years? If you're a regular player and you're complaining, I'm with you. The frustrations are valid. I'm in the trenches with you, but to the weirdos out there who aren't even playing the game and who are just posting that much salt about it for the sake of posting salt, what the fuck are you still doing here? Leave. Just leave. If you can't enjoy it, that is fine. No one wants you here if you're not having fun. You don't need to be here. You've made it clear enough that you don't think highly of the game, so just don't play it. Don't talk about it. Move on with your life. I promise you will be happier for doing that. This is also something that reasonable, normal fucking adults do. You notice the bit where Glad sat there and said that he wasn't feeling like playing Destiny, and then he stopped playing Destiny, and then he only made critique and commentary when he started playing Destiny again? Yeah, normal adult shit. Not like these weirdos who fucking stick around on Twitter and just will talk about anything to do with Destiny being negative and cannot possibly be dissuaded from such an opinion. But far be it from me to expect that Twitter is full of sane and normal and well-adjusted adults. No, that's just the way that the internet is, and I imagine that some of them aren't adults, and I imagine that some of them are also bots designed to amplify spam. I feel like it isn't necessarily the case that this is even a vocal minority. I think this is a micro-minority of people. The sad thing is that generally speaking, those sour attitudes and those extreme viewpoints bubble up to the top because of the way that engagement works on social media. And as a community that may already not be feeling great, our sour moods only get amplified further by people who would rather bitch about something they don't engage with instead of going out and touching grass. And to be really clear, I'm not saying that you guys are incapable of forming your own opinions on something and therefore are easily influenced. I'm saying that it is the general aura of what is created from our phones. You know it. You open Twitter or social media generally, and you just feel like shit. Because ultimately, that's what's being shown to you. You have this moment where all of a sudden, nothing feels like it's making sense anymore. Everything is awful, and the world is showing you awful things through your phone. Great, I hate it here, and I can't leave. And I feel as though it's eating me alive. I celebrate the moments where I get to have a wholesome interaction with someone in the community because it reminds me that the vast majority of the people who engage with any product aren't making tweets like this, and aren't unhinged, and aren't doing it so they can get Twitter Blue monetization. It reminds me that whilst we as a community have a lot of gripes and are very frustrated, we're not all the same degree of crazy that happens to be the loudest thing on Twitter. Being a fan of something sometimes means you have to critique the thing you love. It also means that inevitably if something is good, you're gonna praise it, because that's just the nature of things. But on social media, it feels like any time you do either of those things, you tread on a landmine. We all need to step away from social media generally and just disengage from the noise. Like, completely, for our own sanity as a species. We're all just so locked into our phones that it's hard to ignore. We all need to step away from this because it's starting to become our reality when it's actually just our narrow perception, which is very much being colored and affected by all that we're seeing in front of us, which is just social media. It had always been something which, as a content creator, I'd had to navigate, and as a fan of the game, I'd had to navigate too. But it really did get worse after Lightfall, and there was a point at which I decided to just not engage with the community on things at all, because mentally speaking, that is taxing. You guys might not understand it, but as someone who even just looks at thousands of different posts, it is draining. After you've seen 10 people in a single day saying something terrible about you, it will change your brain chemistry after a while. Depression is rampant amongst content creators. Depression is rampant amongst people who regularly post and scroll social media. These two things are very similar. There is a reason for it. Make the connection. Returning to our timeline, though, after Lightfall, there was the question of how do we come back after a time like this, after these terrible layoffs? We can't possibly see the game improve, can we? Luckily for us, that question was answered, even if we couldn't find a coherent answer ourselves. We would see it in the fifth and final high point that I want to mention, Into the Light and the final shape itself. It all started with Into the Light and Pantheon. It was a love letter to the community, and the vibes surrounding the entire update were immaculate. Everyone wanted to get on the game and play. For this brief period of 4 months from Into the Light in April all the way to the end of July with the final shape, the game felt utterly unstoppable. I dare say it, I was happy. Nothing more, nothing less. And the fact that I felt happy then, but not at many other points during my Destiny career, is a really sad revelation, to be honest. There wasn't much to complain about in the game at the time being. It was mostly being received really well. And of course, when the final shape did launch, it was to rave reviews, with it being one of the top-rated games of the entire year. The final shape's campaign is still seen widely as one of the best in the game, and the raid being integrated into the story was a correct choice, as the Witness was defeated in Salvation's Edge, only to actually be killed once and for all in the first ever 12-player Destiny activity in Excision. All this on top of one of the craziest exotic missions in Dual Destiny, and the addition of genuinely revolutionary things for the game, such as a new enemy faction in the Dread, and of course, the Prismatic subclass. Prior to that, we saw Pantheon bringing one of the best raid experiences, with retuned encounters that demanded perfection and forced teams to truly bring their A-game. Not to mention the changes to some of these encounters which made them feel utterly different in some cases. I'm looking at you in particular, Shadow Rolk. As a player, this mattered because of the timing. It would have been a terrible thing for Destiny to have gone and finished its first 10-year saga with nothing more than a little whimper. It ended instead with a triumphant chorus. They needed a good ending to their story. It was the only way to build back the possibility for players to return later when things began in a fresh place. But as a player, there was something else to it as well. In those 4 months, I felt heard and catered to. It felt as though, as a fan of the game, I knew that this was Destiny at its best, and that it was delivering things that I actually wanted. I, for once, was really proud to talk about the game. I enjoyed my time. It was also a good time for Destiny as a whole because it felt like Bungie was doubling down on the things that we loved. If I've learned anything about the way Destiny succeeds, it's when the studio learns to listen to the community and then is able to discern how best to scratch the itches that we're expressing. Listening to the things that we're talking about wanting, and then discerning, hey, I think this is the way we can do that best. The phrase of "we're listening" is one that's often lambasted in this community, but this is what happens when listening turns into proper action. Take another example, Onslaught. We'd been asking for a horde mode in-game for basically the entire life cycle of Destiny, and this was essentially that. A horde mode, with generous rewards at increments that really respected players' time and investment. This period in the game felt like what it might be like if Bungie's developers were unleashed instead of shackled. And for a moment, it also felt like we had turned the page and we had righted the ship, and it might be possible to push forward and see whatever came next for Destiny as we continued onward to further horizons. And then, the end of July came along, and the second round of layoffs happened. And what occurred in Season of the Witch happened all over again. I remember watching some friends lose their jobs. I remember talking to others who felt guilty that they'd kept theirs. I remember feeling angry. I remember feeling like the outlook for the rest of the game was headed south fast. Because this was the team that had brought us the final shape. One of the greatest expansions in Destiny's history, certainly the greatest expansion in terms of critical acclaim, and now some key team members were gone for good. Despite everything they'd given to the game, and all that they'd done for us as a community. For quite a few months, there was a part of me that stopped caring about the game at all. Until Edge of Fate's narrative turned out to be as good as it was, I didn't really see it even start to recover. I made a half-hearted attempt during Heresy, and there were some really cool things that were going on there, but I didn't see the same kind of future, and honestly, I didn't see anything to stick around for. Not until I was shown that, yeah, Destiny does indeed still have a story that's worth talking about. And as the story and lore guy, maybe there is still a place for me. But ultimately, in this particular sense, I think the second round of layoffs is truly the low that brought about the lowest of lows now, where we are after Edge of Fate. Because in this particular period of time, I feel as though that is how we got here, and that's how we can trace the root of what ails Destiny. Justin Truman, the now studio head, at one point in that often referenced and much maligned GDC talk, stated that the real problem with a live service game isn't anger, it's apathy. After the layoffs, I slid into both. I don't have the same love for the game that I used to. I feel like it's always compromised in one way or another. I don't feel like I want to be too complimentary when I enjoy something for fear of being called a shill. I don't want to critique the game too hard either for the sake of avoiding being called a hate-monger. I definitely don't feel like I can change an opinion that I have easily without being seen as two-faced, because nobody can trust the idea that someone could possibly change an opinion after more time sitting with it. I definitely don't feel like I can tell many of my more general gaming compatriots about the game because of its reputation. And so for me, it feels like the game is slowly growing smaller, and my desire to stick my neck out and be abused on social media of any kind, whether it's Twitter, my own YouTube comments, or on Twitch, is dramatically decreasing. And I know exactly what the comments are going to be, because they're all very predictable depending on what I decide to talk about. Stick to the lore! Dead game. Stop being a shill. All you do is spread hatred. How much did Bungie pay you for this? Remember to put hashtag sponsored. Nobody cares. Guys, as a player, as a content creator, as a fan of this game, as a person, I'm fucking tired. Recently, Datto essentially said that he was out until Renegades. Moments before that tweet, he remarked to Gothalion that the community was going to drive him out long before the game itself did. I don't mean to speak for Datto or put any words in his mouth at this point, so I would wait and see what his further explanation of that particular moment when he said, "I'm out, I'll see you at Renegades" is, but for what it's worth on my side of things, if it is to do with his frustration with the community and the people who occupy it that just decide that they want to make moments of abuse for everyone else, if that is the reason why he's stepping away, yeah, I fucking get it. I understand the sentiment. 10 years ago, this was a place that brought me joy and a sense of belonging. Now, I don't think we're a community anymore. Not in the way that we used to be. We've grown too distrusting and too jaded of each other. Forget about the way we treat Bungie. We've been burned far too many times by the executive management and greed that Bungie's leadership team have forced upon the game, the studio, and us. We've been waiting for consistent greatness to appear for too long. We've been waiting for Destiny's potential to be consistently realized instead of stopping and starting. And in all of that, we've grown so frustrated that we don't have enough unity left to be called a community. And let's be completely honest for just a second. There are communities at the heart of this game. There are still people who I consider to be friends and peers. There are people who I'll happily raid with each week. There's a wider family of people that I really enjoy and that I've got to know and who I consider lifelong friends because of this game. The wider family that used to exist within Destiny as a whole, the wider community that I used to be a part of, the thing that I first felt way back in 2013 when the games community was young and fresh and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. That's gone to me. I wish it would come back. I don't know where it is anymore. The last time I saw it was Into the Light, and then it promptly disappeared with the layoffs. The wider family of people who were not truly family, but who are a part of the same game and the community that I loved and grew with, yeah, that community is not the same as it used to be. Not because people have left, but because people's attitudes have soured and changed to a point where nothing can be celebrated anymore. Nothing can be fun anymore. Being a Destiny player romantically was often referred to as being a guardian. It used to mean being a part of something bigger than just yourself. Now, looking at the community, I think it's more accurate to describe us as a collection of people. Being a fan of Destiny used to mean more. It used to feel like you were on a team, together, and with the right intentions, with each other's best interests at heart, and with the idea that you were there for fun, and for the same reasons. Now, that magic is gone. Laying the blame at Bungie's feet makes a lot of sense, and yet it also masks a lot of nuance. We can blame the environment of social media today for all of everything that's happened in part. We also need to take note that Bungie isn't a monolith. They aren't all Pete Parsons, and they aren't all the Raid and Dungeons team. There are good parts to it, and there are bad parts of it. It's part of the reason why I hate generalizations about a studio, like when someone says Bungie got lazy, or old Bungie was better than new Bungie, or new Bungie is better than old Bungie for that matter. It might be easy to draw such a conclusion when a weapon gets reprised or an armor set gets repeated or something happens in the game that you don't like. But at the moment, I don't think people have heard enough of the horror stories of what's happening within the studio in order to keep things working. None of those stories speak to me of a team that's lazy. They speak to me of a team that's genuinely trying to do what they can, and yet is, honestly, ham-fisted thanks to the decisions of others further up the chain. So, I return to my initial question from all the way at the start of the video. How did we get here? I can't think that the answer wasn't some combination of executive greed and a stubborn refusal to implement what players and developers were asking for. In the wake of the layoffs, I'd heard many stories out of anonymous former employees thanks to reporters such as Paul Tassi and Jason Schreier. People were telling all sorts of terrible stories about how awful management was and how much terrible shit they'd endured under them. They also told us stories about how they wanted to ensure that the developers didn't make the other armor that wasn't in Eververse so pretty so that it didn't outshine the paid cosmetics. I heard further stories about how developers begged the leadership team to allow them to work on commonly requested features only to be flat out refused. That includes some of you Crucible players where they were begging to expand the size of the Crucible team and allow them to increase their scope. I go back through all of this over the last 10 years at the various points at which it's happened, and I feel like there is one clear problem with all of this. It's leadership. Leadership at Bungie was lax. And that's not a new revelation, because not only is it something that I've continually pointed out when it's gone wrong over the years, it's also something where nowadays you can see that the inverse proof of it is also true. Because when there's good leadership, things go well. I look at the work done by Allison and her team on narrative and how keenly looped in they are with what the community wants on the narrative side of things. I look at how in times when the game was suffering, Joe Blackburn, God bless him, really chose to step up and helm the ship as game director. We all meme about the Overload Minotaur, but do you forget what he was doing there? He was streaming that on Twitch because he wanted to be able to understand the game better, so that he could understand what we were talking about, so that he could experience our grievances firsthand and then better understand how we might want to address fixing them, so that he could interact with players and actually get to grips with what the actual problems in the game were that were affecting us on the day-to-day. I look at the authority commanded by Luke Smith and Mark Noseworthy after they delivered expansions like The Taken King and Forsaken, and they drove Destiny to this point of greatness time and time again, only for opportunities to be squandered. The thing is, leaders don't shrink back in times of turbulence and trepidation. They don't follow in times when things are fallow. They lead. Because that's what leaders do. In Destiny's best moments, I think we've seen leaders from within the studio at the development level, not at the executive level, who have been able to step up and drive the game to a direction where players are enjoying it. If we're going to see the game recover, I think we need to find those talented people and cleave to them like a phalanx. The raid and dungeon teams, narrative teams, environment team, music team. We need to hold them close and guard them zealously. If leadership lets them go or puts blocks on what they can endeavor to do, I fear it's all over. We need them to be the examples that lead from the front. They need to be unleashed, not held back. We also need to acknowledge that Eververse in its current state is completely out of control. We are a far cry from the days of old, where it felt like Eververse was a set of optional purchases that helped fund the rest of the game. Do you remember when Whisper of the Worm got ornaments in the Eververse store, and Bungie's developers on the livestream sat there and spoke about them and said, yeah, they are going to cost real money, and they are relatively expensive, but this is going to help us fund new content. And then when 0 Hour came out, they said, yeah, you guys who bought the Whisper of the Worm ornaments, you did that so much that we were able to fund the creation of 0 Hour. That is the kind of stuff that I wish we would see more of. Not just the fact that the investment back into the game took place thanks to our microtransaction spending, but also the transparency around it. You want to know one of the most remarkable conversations I've ever had in my entire gaming career? Something which I was only really a part of by being a fly on the wall. We were talking about monetization in games at a Warframe party one year at PAX. And Warframe's community lead, Rebecca, was there. She's now creative director, but at the time being, she was and still is the most recognizable face in the Warframe dev team. And at this Warframe Tenno party that was organized with the community by DE, someone walked up to her and said, "Hey, thank you so much for all you do on the game. I bought Platinum. Thank you so much." And she then replied, "No, thank you so much for helping pay my salary." Can you imagine that conversation happening in Bungie? I can't. Because that's not the kind of relationship we have with Eververse. It's not the kind of relationship we have with this developer. But I think if everything somehow crazily went right, and if the relationship between Bungie and its player base was different, and if the way that they treated microtransactions was more consumer-friendly, that one day it could be. But right now, it certainly isn't. Right now, we are the frog that was left to boil in water. We have moments on occasion where we regain our lucidity and realize that we're being cooked alive, but for the most part, I think people have just accepted the rampant monetization of the game as is. And yes, it's only cosmetics, and yes, dungeon passes aren't being done anymore going forward, but the balance still seems way off, and the slow additions to Eververse over the years have continually sapped player goodwill, to the point where it is now impossible to have a conversation about Destiny without Eververse being a consistent pain point, something that shows Bungie's ethos and drives players away. When DE looks at Platinum, they seem to look at it in a completely different light. When we, as Destiny players, look at Eververse and when Bungie looks at it, I feel as though it's seen in the exact same way, as a revenue source, and not as an opportunity for the community to support the continued creation of content in the game. At very least, that's my perspective, and I think that in combination with everything else is how we got here. In all of this, though, I know that we have a new studio head in the form of Justin Truman. His old GDC talk that I mentioned earlier is often taken way out of context, in particular that one "don't overdeliver, you're creating patterns" slide. It's actually cited often as this enforcement of a minimum viable product attitude at Bungie. In spite of that being the common take, that's actually not what's going on in that. He's not referring to what they deliver in-game, he's referring to what developers work on as far as how much they crunch. You see, Destiny's developers used to crunch all the time. Bungie was famous for having crunched out Destiny 1 and Destiny 2 at launch as well. Hell, they've been crunching since the times of Halo 2. However, in this GDC talk, there was the note in the slides just before this that if you're developing a live service game, you're either always crunching or never crunching. This slide of over-delivery is not about don't give them too much, you won't create an excellent game. That may be one of the potential knock-on effects, but Justin here is talking about the perspective of crunch. He is not saying don't make excellent games, he is saying don't make so much that you're not able to deliver constantly. However, I think we're all aware of the way in which that quote is constantly talked about. It is talked about in the idea that quality in the game has been allowed to slip, and how the live service games elements have been allowed to become more monetized, about how there is a bar that Bungie is willing to meet and they will not exceed it for the sake of quality being consistent across the whole product. When Justin was enrolled and when the announcement was made of him being the new studio head, he actually made reference to this and stated that he hoped to help create the games that we loved with us involved in the process, something that he stated he hoped would over-deliver. That's a bit of self-awareness that I think is important, and, well, for me, this is a little ray of hope. A hope that the leadership of the studio is going to take a long look at the nature of the game and is going to see and feel what we're all seeing and feeling, and is going to write the course that they're currently plotting so that they can turn things around. Because only through good player sentiment do they have a successful game that carries us all into the future. It's a faint hope. It's probably an incredibly naive one at that, given all the recent debacles at the studio, where it feels like Bungie's recent moves are meandering, unfocused, ham-fisted. Once again, it feels as though they have reverted to being out of touch or unwilling to implement clear and obvious player feedback. Of course, this isn't everyone at the studio, because not everyone at the studio is responsible for every decision, but it's the fact that these decisions are being made at this time, while the community is already at the end of its tether and out of patience. All of this is causing Destiny's player number to be actively shed to a degree that I have never seen in my entire time as a Destiny player. Here, at the other end of 10 years, as I look back at the community, at the studio, and at what's been happening in the past few months and years, I fear that there are two possible definitions of what it means to be a Destiny fan. And Justin, oddly enough, had it exactly right. In his GDC talk, I think he mentioned what could be the best of circumstances. Being a Destiny fan is about being involved. It's about being a part of the creation process by expressing what you want to see. It's about the developers getting to take that feedback and implement it into the game through action. At the best, Destiny and being a fan of it feels like you're part of something bigger that can do things that make you stop in wonder and can bring you a lot of happiness with your friends. There's the other possible definition as well. The way that we all feel right now, I think. The way I fear that most of us will feel, and which will damn this franchise if it's not dealt with. Right now, to be a Destiny fan feels like it's to be ignored. If this is how things continue, Destiny will actually die the death that people have proclaimed for the last decade. I don't want to tell anyone how they should do their job, especially when I know nothing about game development, especially when I know nothing about what it's like to actually be employed inside the studio, especially when I have no experience in any of the many jobs he's worked. But I am going to make one exception now, and I want to say this next bit specifically to studio head Justin Truman. Hi, by the way. I don't think we ever got the chance to talk, but here it is now. Sorry that it's a one-sided conversation. There's another man who bore your surname. I'm sure you've heard of President Harry Truman. I don't need to explain to you, an American, as me, a Brit, that whenever a president comes in, they get to decorate the Oval Office to their tastes. And I'm sure you know that famously, President Truman had a small bit of signage added to the Resolute desk for his tenure, a 4-word slogan on a small plaque that made it clear that he was the one leading the country and that he would bear responsibility for such leadership, the decisions under it, the results of it, and what he would be able to do in order to fix it. That 4-word slogan was, "The buck stops here." Justin? The buck stops with you now. To be clear, I'm not expecting you to be able to intervene and stop everything from going wrong because you are just a human being. I'm also sure that your input on some things is bound to be somewhat limited because the studio that you run is no longer independent and is subservient to Sony generally. I don't think anyone is reasonably expecting you to do extra shifts in the QA lab to test for bugs, or to be writing lore tabs alongside the narrative team, or to be investigating how much exactly an exotic weapon should be nerfed with the sandbox team. However, there are clearly some massive problems with the game right now, and if you didn't know that, I'm terrified for us. I'm sure you do, though. The community feels ignored. As a studio head, it's up to you to direct resources to individuals within the studio that can solve these problems, and also to uphold those members of the studio that are filled with the bright ideas that the player base will love. How we got here into this fine mess does not have to be the way that we continue, but it will be the way all of this ends if changes aren't made. A temporary fix is not enough. Neither is a small hand wave ahead of a new expansion coming out before immediately returning to the way that things were. A fundamental shift needs to happen. A philosophical change is needed at the core of Bungie's leadership in order to see us through the next era of Destiny. Now is the time to take the reins and take control of the ship, and to remember that the buck stops with you. If it doesn't, then truly, we are lost. For what it's worth, I'm always hopeful. But hope, even now, looming eternal as it is very thin on the ground. Please, Justin, for the love of all, do what you can to make a difference. Talk to us about it if you can. I'm sure that everyone is eagerly awaiting the note that there is a captain at the helm of this ship who understands what's going on with it. But that's all for today. That's the end of the video. Thanks again to Geology for the sponsor. And thank you for watching. I'll be back at some point soon with more lore content from universes near and far. Ad Astra. I'll see you Starside.